They mocked her the moment she opened her mouth. Her accent wasn't just different, it made her a target. But what they didn't know was that hidden behind that accent was a mind fluent in 4 languages, a soul rich with culture, and a fire that no amount of teasing could put out. By the time her story reached its peak, the very people who once laughed couldn't stop clapping. Before we begin this emotional and eye-opening journey, take a moment to let us know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments. It's always inspiring to see how far stories like this can travel. Now lean in, because this is one story you'll feel deep in your heart. The morning air in upstate New York carried the crisp bite of late October, the kind that hinted winter was already peeking around the corner. As Amara Johnson stepped off the school bus in front of Jefferson Middle School, she clutched the straps of her backpack tighter, her fingers cold and stiff despite the knitted gloves her grandmother had sent from Atlanta. The tall brick building loomed over her, unfamiliar and uninviting, its windows staring down like silent judges. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the knot in her stomach only pulled tighter. Her mother had tried to prepare her for this new beginning, telling her that moving to a smaller town could be good for them, that it might offer peace, safety, and a fresh start after the whirlwind of grief that followed her father's death. But to Amara, it felt like stepping into a world that had no place for her. A world where everything about her felt just a little too different, a little too loud, a little too seen. As she walked into the building, eyes followed her. Some curious, some indifferent, others already narrowing with quiet judgment. Her boots made soft thuds on the linoleum floor, but to her, it sounded like thunder. She tried to shrink into her jacket, wishing she could blend into the lockers or disappear altogether. The school counselor had assigned a student to walk her to class, a tall, freckled boy named Connor who offered a polite but half-hearted "hey" before turning to lead the way through the crowded hallway. Amara responded with a soft "thank you," her southern drawl gently curling the edges of her words. Connor glanced at her, and though he didn't say anything, the subtle smirk that crept onto his face didn't go unnoticed. They reached her first class, and he waved vaguely before disappearing down the hall, leaving her standing alone at the threshold of a room full of unfamiliar faces. The teacher, a tall woman with gray-streaked hair and horn-rimmed glasses, smiled politely. "Class, this is Amara Johnson. She's just moved here from Georgia. Let's make her feel welcome." A few mumbled greetings floated around the room, but the silence that followed hung heavy in the air. Amara nodded, offered a quiet "hi," and took the empty seat near the window. As the lesson began, she focused hard on her notebook, trying to anchor herself in the comforting ritual of note-taking. But she could feel the occasional glance flicked her way, and each whisper or stifled giggle felt like a pinprick on her skin. When the teacher asked her to read a passage from the textbook, she hesitated. Her voice, soft but clear, filled the room with a warmth shaped by her southern roots and the subtle cadence of her Ghanaian grandmother's speech. She didn't notice the girl in the back mimicking her under her breath, or the boy in the corner recording her with his phone. She was just trying to get through the moment without trembling. By lunchtime, the murmurs had begun. "She sounds like she's from a cartoon," someone whispered as she passed. Another voice muttered, "Why does she talk like that?" Amara found an empty seat in the far corner of the cafeteria and ate in silence, each bite of her sandwich feeling heavier than the last. She tried to tune them out, tried to focus on the way the sunlight caught the edge of the window or the rhythm of trays clattering and laughter bouncing off the walls. But the feeling of being othered, of being outside the invisible circle everyone else seemed to understand, wrapped itself around her like a shroud. That night, back in their small rented apartment above the hardware store, Amara's mother asked her gently, "How was your first day, baby?" Amara shrugged, trying to smile. "It was fine," she said, the lie sitting awkwardly on her tongue. Her mother saw through it but didn't press. Instead, she set a bowl of stew on the table and said, "Your grandma called. She wants to see you this weekend. Maybe we can video chat." Amara nodded. Her grandmother always made her feel grounded, reminded her of who she was beyond what the world saw. They often spoke in Twi, her father's language, a melody that connected her to her heritage and soothed her soul. But now, In this town where difference seemed to draw mockery like moths to flame, she wasn't sure if being herself was something she could afford. As the evening wore on and the cold deepened outside their windows, Amara sat at her desk, surrounded by the books her father had once cherished. Texts in French, Spanish, Japanese, and more. Her fingers traced the spines absent-mindedly, her thoughts drifting to the school, to the way they had looked at her, to the snickering. She whispered a line from a French poem her father once read to her, the words flowing effortlessly from her tongue. She could speak 4 languages fluently, and yet in one single day her voice had become a target. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered to herself, "They don't know me yet." The sentence hung in the air like a promise. Quiet, steady, unshaken. Amara returned to school the next day with a sliver of hope tucked quietly beneath her anxious heart. But it didn't take long for that fragile thread to fray. The moment she walked into homeroom, she could feel the eyes on her again. Curious, calculating, already deciding who she was without knowing anything beyond the sound of her voice. She kept her head down, clutching her binder like a shield, praying she could slip through the day unnoticed. But the hallways of middle school are never kind to those who stand out. By third period, it had already begun. As she opened her mouth to answer a simple question in science class, a boy in the back row whispered to the girl beside him, and both stifled giggles behind cupped hands. Her voice faltered for just a moment, but she pushed through, cheeks burning. The teacher, Mr. Lanning, didn't notice or didn't care. That was the first time, but it wouldn't be the last. In the cafeteria, she stood with her tray, scanning the room for a seat that didn't come with side eyes or smirks. Finally, she sat alone at the edge of a long table, where someone had left behind crumpled napkins and half a juice box. She ate her sandwich quietly, every bite dry and flavorless despite the peanut butter sticking to the roof of her mouth. Behind her, a table of 8th-grade girls began whispering just loud enough for her to hear. "Did you hear her say Tuesday? Sounds like she's from a movie about farmers." One girl burst out laughing and mimicked the way Amara had pronounced the word, exaggerating the syllables until they twisted into mockery. Another girl joined in, her voice high and nasal, pretending to be Amara ordering food at a drive-thru. "Hi, yes, I'll have a hamburger with fries," she said with a drawl so distorted it barely resembled English. The table erupted in laughter. Amara froze, eyes locked on the applesauce container in front of her. She didn't cry. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. When she got home, her mother was still at work, so Amara went straight to her room and closed the door behind her. The apartment was quiet except for the muffled hum of traffic from the street below. She took out her notebook, the one she used to jot down language notes and favorite phrases her father had taught her, but the words on the page blurred. Instead of conjugating verbs in French or outlining sentence structure in Japanese, she stared out the window, her breath fogging the glass. She thought about her old school in Atlanta, where kids had teased each other like all kids did, but never for something so personal, so close to home. Her accent had never been a punchline there. It had just been her voice. Here, it felt like a mask she couldn't take off, one they had already decided meant she was less smart, less cultured, less worth listening to. The days stretched into a quiet rhythm of avoidance. She stopped volunteering in class and kept her answers short when called on. She skipped lunch by pretending she had appointments or stayed behind in the library, hiding between the tall shelves and reading stories in languages she loved, the words like bomb on a scraped knee. But even there, she wasn't safe. One afternoon in the school library, she sat in the back corner, lost in a book of Spanish poems. The bell had rung, and she lingered a few minutes before slipping into the hallway. As she turned the corner, she heard a familiar voice. "There she is, the Southern Belle. Say something, Amara. Come on, say y'all again." It was the same boy from science class, surrounded by 2 others who grinned like it was all a harmless game. Amara looked at them, then turned away without speaking. "Ah, don't be shy. We're just having fun," he said, his voice syrupy with mock sweetness. She walked away, head high, heart pounding. At home that night, her mother made fried plantains and black-eyed peas, trying to lift the weight in the room with stories from her own childhood in Birmingham. People mocked me too, she said. Back then it was because I was too smart or too dark or too quiet. But you know what? None of those kids remember my name now. And I sure don't remember theirs. Amara nodded, but she couldn't quite shake the ache that clung to her ribs. Her mother reached across the table and took her hand. You are not here to fit in. You are here to grow, even if it's through concrete. Later that night, Amara curled up in bed with her laptop and headphones. She pulled up a video of her grandmother telling a story in Twi, the same story her father used to tell her when she was younger, about the little girl who could speak with the birds because she listened harder than anyone else. Amara mouthed the words along with her grandmother, the rhythm familiar, the meaning deep. For a moment, she forgot about the snickers and the whispers. For a moment, she was simply a girl with a voice full of songs waiting to be sung. The weeks that followed blurred together like smudged ink on a damp page, days soaked in silence and the quiet ache of being unseen in all the wrong ways. At school, Amara floated on the edges, barely speaking unless called upon, answering with a clipped yes or no, always careful, always measured. Yet beneath that quiet exterior, something far richer stirred. A private world built not on popularity or belonging, but on memory, language, and love. It was in the hushed hours of the evening, when the streetlights flickered outside her window and her mother's soft humming drifted in from the kitchen, that Amara came alive again. She would sit cross-legged on the floor beside her father's old bookshelf, a collection he had once proudly called his language garden. Books in French, Spanish, Twi, and Japanese filled the shelves, some worn with age, others still crisp and marked with his handwritten notes. Each spine was a seed, and each page a promise of something larger than the tiny world that now tried to crush her spirit. At school, none of that existed. Her classmates only saw the surface, a girl who spoke with a drawl, whose words had too much rhythm, whose vowels stretched a little too long. They never guessed that at home, she read Voltaire in French, could recite haikus in Japanese, and sometimes dreamed in Spanish. Her grandmother, calling each Sunday afternoon from Atlanta, always asked to speak in Twi, gently guiding Amara through complex phrases, smiling wide through the video screen when she got them right. Her father had once told her that to speak someone's language was to hold a key to their soul. She had never forgotten that. But now, walking the halls of Jefferson Middle School, surrounded by eyes that mocked and mouths that mimicked, she kept those keys tucked deep in her pockets, too afraid to unlock the parts of herself she cherished most. One afternoon, during English class, the teacher assigned a short presentation on a topic of personal interest. Amara's breath caught in her throat. This was the kind of opportunity she once would have leapt at. Back in Atlanta, she had given a presentation entirely in French for her old class, complete with a slideshow and a short poem she had written herself. But here, even the thought of standing in front of her peers made her stomach churn. She chose the safest topic she could think of, the life cycle of a butterfly, and read it in the most neutral voice she could muster. When she returned to her seat, a girl behind her leaned over and muttered, "Nice voice. Did the butterfly fly in slow motion too?" The snickers came on cue. Amara didn't turn around, but the pain of that moment followed her home like a shadow. She tried to shake it by burying herself in her studies, but every insult, every whisper found a place to nest. Her mother noticed the change in her. Not just the sadness, but the shrinking. She had seen it before in other places, on other faces, even in her own reflection long ago. That night, after dinner, she knocked gently on Amara's door. "You know," she said, her voice low, "your father used to say that being different was like being a lighthouse. Not everyone would understand the way you shine, but someone out there is looking for your light." Amara didn't respond at first. She sat on her bed, the same French novel open in her lap, unread for nearly an hour. Finally, she whispered, "But what if they never stop laughing?" Her mother walked in, sat beside her, and placed a hand over hers. "Then laugh back, baby, but do it in 4 languages." That night, Amara opened her journal and wrote in Spanish first, then French, then Twi, then English. She wrote not about butterflies or school projects, but about voices, how they rise and fall, how some sting and others sing, how hers was a collection of echoes from all the people she loved. Her accent, once a source of shame, felt like a chorus now. A little Georgia, a little Ghana, a little of every country she and her father had studied together. She wrote until her hand cramped and her eyes blurred, and for the first time in weeks, she slept soundly. But school remained a battlefield. During a group project in social studies, her assigned teammates barely acknowledged her. They finished most of the work without consulting her, assigning her the easiest part, making the title page. When she handed it in, carefully handwritten in calligraphy and translated into French underneath, one of the boys sneered, "What, trying to sound fancy now?" She looked at him, then at the teacher, who didn't say a word. Amara nodded silently and returned to her seat. Another missed chance to be seen, another lesson in invisibility. Still, inside her, something had shifted. The pain hadn't gone away, but she was starting to understand it. It wasn't hers to carry alone. It belonged to a system, a culture, a world that didn't know how to hold space for voices that weren't born from sameness. Her voice was rich with history, with stories layered in tone and time, and little by little she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the very thing they mocked was the very thing that made her extraordinary. It began with whispers, then turned to laughter, and finally sharpened into something colder, more deliberate. What had started as teasing grew into a steady undercurrent of mockery that threaded its way through Amara's days like a song she never wanted to hear but couldn't turn off. It wasn't just about her accent anymore. It was the way she walked, the way she raised her hand in class, the way she quietly packed up her lunch each day and left without a word. Middle school could be cruel, but this wasn't the careless cruelty of bored children. This was intentional, and it grew more precise with each passing week. One morning during English, the teacher asked Amara to read a passage aloud from a classic novel. The words sat in her throat like stones. She could feel the anticipation around her, the subtle leaning in, as if her voice had become a kind of entertainment. As she read, carefully articulating each line, a boy in the third row began mouthing her words with exaggerated lip movements. Another girl giggled and whispered something into her phone, recording under the desk. Amara's eyes stayed locked on the page, her voice never wavering, but inside she felt something crack just a little more. The video made its way around school before lunch. A clip of Amara's voice, slowed down, distorted, layered with cartoon sound effects, circulated through group chats and private messages. No one said anything to her directly, but she noticed how the laughter in the hallways seemed to grow louder when she passed, how shoulders turned away a little quicker, how even teachers glanced over her more often, no longer calling on her unless necessary. It was a quiet exile enforced by silence and smirks, a system of exclusion that didn't need rules to keep her on the outside. That afternoon, in history class, when the teacher paired students off for a group activity, no one made eye contact with her. She was left standing alone until the teacher finally placed her with a student who sighed and rolled his eyes. They worked together in near silence, her contributions either ignored or erased. She wrote the bulk of the report herself, but when the project was presented, her partner spoke for both of them, barely mentioning her name. At home, her mother tried to draw her out. "Tell me something good," she would say at dinner, smiling in that gentle way that tried to soften the world's hard edges. But Amara could only shrug, fork pushing food around her plate, appetite lost to the weight in her chest. Her mother didn't push, but Amara could feel her watching more closely, her silences stretching a little longer, her hugs lasting a few seconds more. One night, Amara finally let herself cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears that slipped down her cheeks as she stared at her bedroom ceiling, headphones in, her grandmother's voice in Chui crackling through the speakers like a lullaby from another world. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't have the words in English that felt big enough to hold the ache. The worst moment came a week later. They were in the library for group research, and Amara, out of habit, slipped into soft conversation with herself in French as she skimmed a book. A nearby student overheard. "What language is that?" the boy asked loudly, eyebrows raised. "Or are you just making stuff up now?" Another chimed in, "Maybe it's alien talk." Or witch stuff. The librarian was shelving books nearby and said nothing. Amara froze, then closed the book and left it on the table, walking out of the library without a word. No one followed her. No one called her back. That night, as she lay in bed, she remembered the words her father used to say when she was little and unsure of herself. You don't need the world to applaud you to know your voice is beautiful. You just need to believe it. She whispered those words to herself like a spell, like armor. But even that memory couldn't stop the dread curling in her chest. The next morning, she told her mother she didn't feel well. It wasn't a lie. Her stomach churned. Her hands trembled. Her voice, so full of music in the quiet of her room, felt too heavy to carry out into that building again. Her mother looked at her for a long time, then simply said, "Okay, baby, today, rest." The silence of the apartment was a different kind of quiet that day. Amara sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open in front of her. She wrote a single sentence at the top of the page in each of the 4 languages she knew. I am not broken. Not in French, not in Spanish, not in Twi, not in English. She wrote it again and again until the words filled the page. Not as a mantra, not as a prayer, as truth. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the rain came down in long silver threads, soaking the school's brick walls and cloaking the campus in a gray hush. Amara, having once again skipped lunch, wandered the corridors of the second floor, her backpack slung low, feet dragging as though each step cost her something. She wasn't sure where she was going, only that anywhere away from the cafeteria felt safer. The voices, the laughter, the looks. It was all too much lately. So she wandered until she saw a door slightly ajar at the end of the hallway, light spilling softly from the crack and the faint sound of conversation floating out, punctuated by the rustle of paper and occasional laughter. Not mocking or cruel, but light and earnest, like spring wind through trees. The sign taped to the front of the door read Language Club, all welcome. She paused, her hand hovering near the knob, torn between the habit of retreating and the flicker of curiosity. That word, language, called to something deep inside her, something buried but unbroken. Before she could talk herself out of it, the door creaked open wider and a voice called out gently, "You looking for Language Club?" It was a woman, mid-30s maybe, with curly dark hair and warm brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a sunflower-colored scarf that stood out against the grayness of the day. "Come in, we're just getting started," she said with a smile that made it feel less like an invitation and more like a welcome home. Amara hesitated for just a breath, then stepped inside. The room smelled of cinnamon tea and old books, and around the table sat a small group of students, 4 or 5, leafing through language sheets and chatting about phrases in different tongues. On the whiteboard were phrases in French, Spanish, and Japanese, written neatly in 3 columns. The woman introduced herself as Ms. Rivera, the club advisor and a substitute teacher who also taught Spanish part-time. "Today, we're practicing introductions in different languages," she said. "You can just listen, no pressure to participate." Amara nodded, heart thumping quietly as she took a seat at the edge of the group. One boy stumbled through his Spanish greeting, drawing laughter from the others. Not cruel, but shared and kind. When Ms. Rivera asked if anyone knew how to say, "Pleased to meet you" in French, silence fell over the room. The words hovered unspoken in the air. Then, before she could stop herself, Amara whispered, "Enchanté de faire votre connaissance." The room turned to her in unison. Ms. Rivera's eyes lit up. "That's perfect," she said, beaming. "Your accent is beautiful. Do you speak French?" Amara nodded slowly, unsure if this was the part where everything turned. But the others just looked at her, curious and quietly impressed. "Say it again?" one girl asked. "That sounded so cool." Amara repeated it a little louder this time. Someone clapped softly. The mood shifted. For the first time since arriving at Jefferson Middle School, Amara felt the floor beneath her feet steady just a bit. Ms. Rivera asked her a few more questions, what languages she knew, where she'd learned them, if she'd ever lived abroad. Amara explained softly that her father had been a linguistics professor and that languages were a way they connected, especially before he passed. She didn't mention the teasing or the mockery or how she'd been hiding her voice like something shameful. She just spoke and they listened. At the end of the meeting, Ms. Rivera handed her a printout of some beginner Japanese phrases and said, "We could use your help if you'd like to come back. No pressure, but I think you'd be a wonderful addition to the club." Amara took the paper with both hands and nodded, a quiet warmth blooming in her chest. For the first time, the idea of staying at school past the final bell didn't feel like a punishment. That night at home, Amara's mother immediately noticed the change. There was something brighter in her eyes, something unspoken but unmistakable. "How was school?" she asked as she stirred a pot of jollof rice on the stove. "Okay," Amara said, then after a pause added, "I found a club, language club. I might go again." Her mother turned, spoon in hand, and smiled wide. "Well, that sounds just about perfect for you." Later, as Amara read quietly in her room, she found herself repeating the phrase from earlier, not just in French but in Spanish, in Chui, and then in English. "Pleased to meet you," as if she were saying it to herself for the first time in a long while. As if, maybe, the version of her that loved language and knowledge and expression wasn't lost, just waiting for the right door to open. The next Thursday, when the rain had given way to a chilled wind that scraped dry leaves along the sidewalks, Amara returned to language club with a bundle of nerves hidden beneath her coat. She had rehearsed what she might say, what she wouldn't say, and how much of herself she was willing to reveal. But even with all that planning, when she walked into the room and saw Ms. Rivera's warm smile and the easy way the other students greeted her, something in her chest loosened. It was still small, this sense of safety, but it was real, like the first flame flickering against a long night. That day's meeting was about cultural idioms, how language reflects not just vocabulary but worldview. One student brought in an Italian phrase, another shared a Korean proverb, and Amara, without quite meaning to, spoke up. "In Chui," she said softly, "there's a saying, duaba ben na enyadua? It means, which fruit does not have a tree? It reminds us that everything comes from something, that we all have roots somewhere." The room grew quiet, but not the awkward silence she was used to. This one was thoughtful, listening. One boy nodded slowly and said, "That's kind of beautiful." Ms. Rivera smiled at her like someone who already knew the truth and was just waiting for Amara to catch up. After the meeting, as the others filtered out, Ms. Rivera asked if Amara had a few minutes to help pack up. They moved chairs and gathered papers in a comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't demand conversation but leaves room for it if it comes. Then, as they folded the last stack of worksheets, Ms. Rivera said, "You know, you have a real gift. You speak with precision but also with feeling. That's rare. Have you ever considered entering the Regional Language Showcase?" Amara blinked. "Showcase?" Ms. Rivera nodded. "It's like a small performance contest. Students present in another language a story, a speech, even poetry. It's not about winning. It's about sharing who you are." Amara hesitated, her mind flickering with all the voices that had mocked her, all the times she had hidden just to survive the day. "I don't think I'm ready," she said. Ms. Rivera placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're already more ready than most." That night, Amara couldn't stop thinking about it. She sat at her desk staring at a blank page, then slowly began to write. Not in English, but in French. A memory came to her unbidden. Her father in their old apartment in Atlanta, reciting the final lines of a French poem about identity and light and belonging. She had memorized it not just because it was beautiful, but because it made her feel visible. The next morning, before school, she stood in front of the mirror and whispered the lines aloud. Her accent curled around the vowels like a ribbon, soft but sure. She didn't sound like anyone else. She sounded like herself. Later that week, during study hall, one of the students from language club, a quiet boy named Isaac, sat beside her. "You speak Chui, right?" he asked in a low voice, almost shy. "My grandma's from Ghana, but I only know a few words. My dad never taught me. He said it was useless here." Amara looked at him, surprised by the confession. She had never heard anyone else in the school mention Ghana, let alone admit to a buried piece of themselves. "It's not useless," she said. "It's a whole world you're carrying." Isaac smiled, a little embarrassed, but grateful. Could you teach me something? Just one phrase. Amara nodded. Of course. How about Metowa? It means, I love you. Or, more generally, I care for you. Isaac repeated it carefully, his pronunciation rough but eager. They both laughed, not because it was perfect, but because it mattered. From that moment, something began to shift. Isaac started sitting near her in language club, then at lunch, and before long, others followed. A girl who was learning Mandarin asked Amara to quiz her. Another student who spoke Arabic brought in sweets during one meeting and offered her the first one. It wasn't a floodgate, not yet, but it was enough to let light in. Enough to make her believe that the version of herself she had buried might actually belong. Not just in her room, not just in her memories, but out loud in the world. At home, her mother noticed. Your shoulders are lighter, she said one evening as they folded laundry together. Like you're carrying less alone. Amara smiled. I met someone who wants to learn Chui, she said. He didn't know it was still part of him. Her mother nodded slowly. That's what language does. It brings us back to who we are. That night, Amara pulled out her old journals, flipping through pages of words she had once hidden. She didn't stop to edit or correct them. She just read, remembering each line, each phrase, as though she were learning herself all over again. And this time she wasn't afraid. The hallways no longer felt like a maze of shadows. Though the whispers hadn't completely disappeared, they no longer pierced Amara's skin the way they used to. They buzzed faintly behind her, but now she walked with her head higher, her steps a little more certain, like someone finally returning to the home inside herself. She still felt the ache of what had been said and done, still carried those memories like fingerprints on glass, but something had changed, not in the world, but in her. It was during the third week of language club when Ms. Rivera brought in a flyer, its bold blue letters announcing the upcoming regional showcase. I think you should do it, she said again, softer this time, sliding the paper across the table. Amara stared at it, the words swimming in front of her. A part of her still hesitated. Wasn't she the girl who had once been laughed at just for reading aloud? But another part, the one that had been slowly waking up, burned hotter now. That night, she pulled out her old notebooks, the ones she used to fill with passages and poems and ideas in every language she loved. She flipped through them with reverence, stopping when she found a poem she had once written with her father. It was about belonging, written in French, then translated into English and Chui. Her handwriting was younger, rounder, but the emotion in the words was still sharp and clear. The poem wasn't just about finding home. It was about building it, word by word, voice by voice. The next day, she stayed after school and approached Ms. Rivera privately. I think I want to try, she said, for the showcase. Ms. Rivera's smile could have lit the entire hallway. What will you perform? Amara hesitated. A poem I wrote with my dad, in French, but I want to weave in Chui and English too. It's all part of the same truth. Ms. Rivera nodded, her eyes bright. That's going to be something powerful. Over the next 2 weeks, Amara practiced each night in front of her mirror, then in front of her mom, then once, hesitantly, in front of Isaac, who listened so quietly it made her more nervous than applause ever could. When she stumbled over a phrase or choked up halfway through, he just smiled and said, Say it again. I want to hear it right. Each time she recited the poem, her voice grew stronger. She no longer tried to smooth her accent or tuck it away. She let it sing. Let the rhythms of Chui and the lyricism of French live beside her English without apology. It was the sound of all the pieces of her finally speaking in harmony. The night before the showcase, Amara barely slept. She lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, whispering lines to herself in the dark. In her mind, she saw the faces of those who had laughed at her, those who had ignored her, and those who had never cared to understand. But she also saw her father, sitting at the kitchen table in his reading glasses, smiling as she read him the same poem for the first time. She remembered how he'd closed his eyes when she spoke, as if each word had weight and warmth. You carry more than a voice, he had said. You carry a legacy. The next morning, She wore a simple dress, pale yellow with soft embroidery at the cuffs, and her mother braided her hair back from her face, fingers gentle and steady. "No matter what happens," her mother said as she fastened the final braid, "you are already the bravest person I know." Amara nodded, swallowing hard. At the venue, a modest auditorium filled with students from across the district, Amara waited backstage, her heart thudding so loudly she was sure the others could hear it. The list of performers was long. Some danced, some gave speeches in Mandarin, Arabic, Italian. Then her name was called. She stepped onto the stage, blinking under the lights, the microphone waiting like a question. She looked out and spotted Ms. Rivera in the third row, Isaac a few seats over, her mother in the back near the aisle, her phone already raised to record. She took a deep breath, then spoke the first line in French, her voice clear and rich. The audience stilled. Then she moved into English, letting her cadence slow, deliberate, until it gave way to the warm, earthy tones of Chui. The languages flowed one into another, stitched together by memory and emotion. And with each line, she felt her fear burn away, replaced by something fiercer, pride. When she reached the final verse, a line written entirely in Chui, she paused just before delivering it, letting the silence stretch. Then she spoke it, not just from her lips, but from her chest, from the place where the fire had long been smoldering. For a second, there was nothing. Then came the applause. It began politely, then grew louder, fuller, until the room was on its feet. Amara stood still, soaking in the sound, not as validation, but as recognition. They had heard her, all of her, and she had never felt more seen. The morning after the showcase, everything felt different, though nothing had outwardly changed. The same sunlight streamed through her bedroom curtains, her shoes still sat by the door with laces untied, and her mom still called out a reminder not to forget her lunch. But inside, something in Amara had shifted entirely. It was subtle, quiet, but unmistakably real. The way a tide pulls away from the shore before rushing back in, stronger, fuller, full of power. For so long, she had tried to shrink herself to fit inside the silence others expected of her. But now she realized she didn't need to fit. She needed to speak, and she would. As she walked through the school halls that day, backpack resting between her shoulder blades like armor, she noticed the way people looked at her had changed. A few students nodded, others simply stared longer than usual, and one girl from 8th grade whispered to her friend, "That's the girl from the showcase." Amara didn't flinch. She kept walking, chin slightly lifted, not out of arrogance, but as someone who had finally remembered she had every right to be seen. In homeroom, her teacher paused while taking attendance and looked up over her glasses. "Amara," she said, her voice tinged with something like surprise. "That was quite a performance yesterday. I didn't know you spoke so many languages." Amara gave a soft smile and simply said, "I do." The class grew quiet. No one laughed. No one mocked. If anything, there was a reverence in the air, uncertain and curious. During lunch, she took her usual seat near the window, but this time, she wasn't alone for long. Isaac joined her first, sitting without asking, just offering her a grin and a fist bump. Then a girl from language club. Then another student who had never spoken to her before. They didn't crowd her or gush. They just sat, eating in an easy, quiet way that spoke louder than compliments. And Amara, for the first time since she'd arrived at this school, didn't feel like she was surviving lunch. She was living it. Later that week, Ms. Rivera posted photos from the showcase on the school bulletin board just outside the library. Amara's picture was right in the center, standing on stage, eyes forward, mouth mid-verse. Someone had written "beautiful" in small, neat letters beside it. She didn't know who, but she felt it land inside her like a note carried by the wind. Slowly, the isolation that had clung to her like a second skin began to peel away. It wasn't all perfect. There were still some students who eyed her with skepticism, and not everyone clapped when she walked into a room. But the difference now was that she didn't need their approval. Her value wasn't up for vote. Word spread that she was helping Isaac learn Chui, and soon a group of students from different grades began showing up at language club just to hear her read aloud. They asked her how to pronounce things in French, how to write names in different scripts, how it felt to know more than one way to say I love you. At first, she was shy in answering, but little by little, she leaned into it. She even started bringing in her father's old books, letting others flip through them carefully, the same pages she had once guarded like treasure. It was during one of these club meetings, while explaining the origins of a French idiom, that Amara felt something unexpected rise in her. A joy so full it made her catch her breath. Not because she was being praised or watched, but because she was sharing. Her voice had become a bridge not just between languages, but between people. One of the newer members, a boy named Kareem, turned to her and said, "You should teach, like actually teach one day. I'd take your class." The others laughed and nodded. Amara smiled wide, not with disbelief, but with recognition. She had always known she had something to give, now others saw it too. By the end of that week, the school counselor reached out and asked if she would be willing to help create a peer tutoring circle for students learning second languages. "We've never had a program like this before," the counselor said. "But after what we saw at the showcase, I think you've inspired more students than you realize." Amara said yes before even thinking. She wasn't afraid anymore. Each time she stood in front of someone and spoke, it was as if she was telling the younger version of herself, "You're not too much. You're just enough." The same halls that once echoed with taunts now carried different sounds. Questions, laughter, shared stories, and words in many tongues. And through it all, Amara walked not ahead of anyone, not behind, but with others, side by side, exactly where she was meant to be. It began like any other Thursday. The morning sun slanted lazily through the windows of Jefferson Middle School, catching the dust in long golden streaks, and the halls hummed with the usual mix of sleepy chatter and slamming lockers. Amara walked in just after the first bell, her books tucked against her chest, earbuds playing a quiet loop of her father's favorite jazz. Her mind was already half-focused on that afternoon's peer tutoring session. She had planned a short lesson comparing Spanish and French sentence structure, something she knew would get the group talking. As she made her way toward homeroom, a familiar voice called her name. Isaac, jogging up beside her with a grin. "You ready to run this school yet?" he teased. Amara laughed, not nervously like she once might have, but from the gut, like someone who had found her rhythm. "One language at a time," she replied, bumping his shoulder. But things shifted in second period. Ms. Rivera appeared at the door of Amara's science class, her expression unreadable. She gestured to the teacher, who nodded and called Amara's name softly. As she followed Ms. Rivera down the hallway, her mind raced with all the possibilities. Had someone complained? Had she said something wrong? But when they reached the counselor's office, Ms. Rivera gave her a gentle squeeze on the shoulder and said, "Just be honest. You've done nothing wrong." Inside, the counselor, Mr. Jordan, sat with two people Amara didn't recognize. A tall man in a pressed shirt and a woman with a small notebook, both with school district badges. The man smiled warmly. "Amara," he said, "we've heard about the incredible work you've been doing. Not just your performance at the showcase, but the tutoring group, the mentorship, even the language projects you've led in Ms. Rivera's club." Amara nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. The woman spoke next. "We're organizing a statewide multicultural youth conference next month, and we'd like you to be one of the student speakers." The room fell quiet, the words hanging there like something sacred. Amara blinked. "Me?" she whispered. "Why me?" The man leaned forward, folding his hands. "Because students like you are exactly what education should be about: resilience, passion, leadership. You didn't just rise above what others said about you. You built something for others to rise into. That's extraordinary." Amara sat there, stunned, her fingers curled in her lap. Part of her wanted to say no, to retreat into the safety of her quiet victories. But then she remembered the sound of applause at the showcase, the look on Isaac's face when he repeated his first full sentence in Twi, the way her mother's eyes had brimmed with tears when she showed her the peer tutoring flyer. She remembered her father's voice. You don't need the world to applaud you to know your voice is beautiful. You just need to believe it. She looked up and said, "Yes, I'll do it." News traveled faster than she expected. By lunchtime, students were stopping her in the halls. Some just to say congratulations, others to ask what the conference would be like, and a few just to smile at her like they finally saw something they hadn't before. Even a few of her old classmates, the ones who used to snicker behind her back, now kept their distance differently, not in mockery but maybe, just maybe, in respect. That evening, as she sat at the kitchen table with her mom, retelling the whole story between bites of rice and stew, her mom reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. "But more than that, I'm proud. Not because you're being seen now, but because you never gave up when they didn't." In the days that followed, Amara prepared her speech in 3 languages, weaving them together like strands in a single story. She spoke about her journey, about voice and shame and healing and power. She didn't try to make it perfect. She made it true. Ms. Rivera read the draft and cried. Isaac offered to help her practice and even designed a digital background for her slideshow. The tutoring group grew by 5 new students, one of whom spoke Haitian Creole and asked if they could add it to the next club meeting. Amara said yes, thrilled. Then came the email. The district had posted a video clip of Amara's showcase performance on its social media channel, and it had been shared over 10,000 times. Comments flooded in from people she didn't know. Students, teachers, even parents, from across the state. Some wrote that they wished they had spoken up when they were her age. Others said they felt braver just watching her. And there, among all the messages, was one from a university linguistics professor who had known her father. It read, "I taught with your dad. He always said you'd grow up to carry the world in your voice. He was right." That night, Amara stood on the balcony outside her apartment, the city lights blinking gently below, her phone buzzing beside her with messages she couldn't even keep up with anymore. She closed her eyes, breathed in the cool night air, and whispered in Twi, then French, then English, "I belong. Not because they say so, but because I know so." It was not the end of her journey, but it was, without a doubt, the day everything changed. The day of the statewide youth conference arrived like a sunrise after a storm. Quiet, calm, but charged with something radiant beneath the surface. Amara awoke before her alarm, the sky outside still painted in soft violet tones. Her heart beat with the kind of nerves that came not from fear, but from something larger, responsibility, anticipation, perhaps even destiny. She dressed with care, choosing a deep blue blouse embroidered with a subtle West African motif her mother had sewn by hand, and black slacks that made her feel grounded. Her mother braided her hair in silence, not out of worry, but reverence, as if this morning were sacred. "Speak from your heart," she said as she fastened the final braid, "and they will listen." The conference took place in the district's largest auditorium, a polished space with arched ceilings and warm lights that made the wood-paneled walls glow like a theater stage. Hundreds of students, educators, community leaders, and families filled the seats, buzzing with conversation and camera flashes. Amara sat backstage, hands folded over her printed speech, eyes closed as she listened to the muffled voices of speakers ahead of her. She whispered parts of her poem beneath her breath, the lines familiar now, not just from memory but from soul. When her name was announced, there was a pause, then polite applause, and she stepped out into the light. She didn't look at the crowd right away. She stepped to the podium, placed her paper down, and let the silence settle. Then she lifted her head. Rows of faces stretched before her. Strangers, yes, but also people waiting to hear something real. She began not with a quote or a list of credentials but with a single phrase in Twi. The room stilled. Then she translated it to English. "They tried to make me forget my voice, but I remembered." She spoke slowly at first, then with growing confidence, her voice rising and falling like music, each line carrying the weight of her experience but none of its bitterness. She told them about the teasing, the mocking laughter that once made her flinch. She told them about Language Club, and the first time she heard someone say they wanted to learn Twi. She wove her father's words through it all like thread, sharing how language became not just her passion, but her path to healing. Midway through, she recited the poem. First in French, then English, then Chui. Each version layered with meaning, each word more than a sound. It was memory, hope, pride. By the time she reached the final line, her voice no longer trembled. It rang out clear and sure, not asking to be heard, but expecting to be. When she finished, the silence that followed was brief but deep, as if the audience needed a moment to take it all in. Then the applause came, not a slow build, but a wave, like something breaking free. People stood. Some wiped tears. Others clapped so hard their rings flashed in the light. Backstage, a teacher from another school hugged her and said, "My daughter speaks 2 languages and hides it. You just changed that." A student from a nearby city whispered, "I didn't know I was allowed to sound like me until today." Ms. Rivera was there too, tears in her eyes, beaming as if Amara were her own. "You didn't just speak," she said. "You opened a door for every kid who's ever been told they didn't belong." Amara smiled, not wide, but full, the kind of smile that grows from the inside and takes its time reaching the surface. When she returned to Jefferson Middle School the next day, she expected things to be quieter. She didn't expect the principal to be waiting at the front office with a grin and a certificate. "We've never had a student represent us like that," he said. "You've made this school proud." Then came the announcements over the PA system. Her name was mentioned. The conference was mentioned. Her poem was quoted. In homeroom, students clapped when she walked in. Even a few of the kids who used to roll their eyes now looked at her differently. Not with admiration necessarily, but with something quieter, more important. Respect. By lunch, teachers were stopping her in the hallway to shake her hand. One science teacher said, "You've inspired me to start using multilingual materials in my classroom." A librarian approached and asked if she'd be willing to record readings of her poem for the school's morning broadcast. "We'd love to feature a different version each day next week," she said. Amara nodded, her heart full. Even students who had never spoken to her before were suddenly eager to share their own stories. One girl said she spoke Farsi at home but never told anyone. Another boy said his grandma taught him Cree, and he'd love to teach others if someone helped him feel brave enough. Later that week, language club's attendance doubled. They moved from their small classroom to the library's reading space, pulling chairs into circles, laughter and words bouncing in French, Spanish, Korean, Swahili, and more. It was no longer just Amara's club. It was everyone's space now. As she looked around the room, watching classmates share their languages and their stories like treasured gifts, Amara felt something rise in her again. Not nerves, not fear, but that same fire that had carried her to the podium. The fire that had been there all along, waiting for her to stop whispering and start roaring. Spring came gently that year, arriving not with sudden storms or harsh winds, but with slow blooms along the edges of sidewalks and a softness in the morning air that made the walk to school feel less like a routine and more like a quiet invitation. Amara had changed, that much was clear, but the world around her had changed too, or maybe it had always held this kind of kindness, waiting for someone brave enough to reach for it. The tutoring circle she helped start was now its own small community, meeting twice a week in the library's sunlit corner, filled with voices laughing, stumbling, correcting, and growing. Language Club had become something more than just a club, it was a movement. Students wore buttons that said, "My voice matters," in multiple languages. The bulletin board, once filled with notices, now displayed handwritten notes in Arabic, Chinese, Swahili, Portuguese, and Amara's own Chui, each one signed with a first name and a proud little flag drawn beside it. But the most surprising moment came one afternoon when a 7th grade teacher asked Amara to speak to a group of younger students just starting middle school. "They're nervous," she said. "Many of them are multilingual or come from immigrant families. Some are already getting teased. I think they need to hear from someone like you." Amara agreed, though she felt a flicker of nerves stir in her belly. Speaking to strangers had become easier, but speaking to younger kids who might see her not just as a voice, but as a symbol, that felt heavier. She walked into the classroom the next day to find 20 pairs of eyes watching her, wide and uncertain. She smiled gently, pulling out the same phrase she had used at the youth conference. "They tried to make me forget my voice," she said. "But I remembered." The room went still. Then, slowly, hands began to rise. One boy asked if it was okay to speak both Spanish and English at school. Another girl said she missed speaking Vietnamese because no one else understood it. Amara answered every question not like a teacher, but like an older sister, someone who had once stood exactly where they were, unsure whether her truth would ever be welcome. That evening, as she walked home beneath a sky streaked in amber and lavender, she took a long route through the neighborhood. She passed the small corner store where the owner now greeted her by name. She passed the community center where flyers hung for language exchanges and cultural dance nights, a few of which she had helped plan. As she turned onto her street, she saw her mom standing on the porch, talking to someone. A tall man in a pressed coat, a briefcase in hand. As Amara got closer, she froze. The man turned and her breath caught. It was Mr. Desmond, her father's old college friend. The same one who had written to her after the youth conference, telling her he used to teach alongside her dad. He had driven hours to meet her in person. They sat on the porch for over an hour, sipping ginger tea as he shared stories of her father's lectures. His fierce belief in the power of words, his habit of writing entire speeches in 3 languages just to remind students they belonged wherever their voice could be heard. "He was always dreaming big for you," Mr. Desmond said. He used to say, "Amara will speak for those who haven't found their words yet. And now look at you." Later that night, Amara opened her old notebooks, not to read the past, but to write something new. For the first time, she didn't write in secret. She sat at the kitchen table, her mother humming softly nearby, and let the words spill from her without fear. She wrote about the girl who used to sit alone, and the boy who asked to learn Chui, and the teacher who saw her before she saw herself. She wrote about her accent, the one they laughed at, and how it had become her anthem. Then she wrote something she'd never written before, a letter to her younger self. She told her not to shrink, not to let the echoes of ignorance drown out the truth of who she was. "You are not too much," she wrote. "You are exactly enough." The next morning, the school announced that Amara had been chosen to deliver the closing remarks at the year-end assembly. She would be speaking not just as a student, but as a representative of the entire class. As she stepped onto the stage in front of the whole school, she didn't carry notes this time. She spoke from memory, from experience, from heart. She spoke of stories that connect us, of accents that carry generations, of the courage it takes to stand when the world tells you to sit. She ended in Chui, then English, then French. And when she stepped back from the microphone, the applause wasn't loud because it had to be. It was loud because it was real. In that moment, Amara looked out at the sea of faces, students, teachers, friends, even those who had once mocked her, and realized she had not just reclaimed her voice. She had changed the very space where that voice had once been silenced. And in doing so, she had done more than speak. She had taught others to listen. And so, Amara's journey reminds us all that our voices, no matter how they sound, carry the power to inspire, connect, and transform. What once made her feel small became the very thing that made her unforgettable. Her accent wasn't a flaw. It was a flag, a melody, a memory. And in speaking boldly, she taught others how to listen with open hearts. Thank you so much for watching and staying with us through this powerful story. Your time, your presence, and your willingness to reflect mean the world to us. If this story moved you, made you think, or reminded you of your own experiences, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment to leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your feelings, or even a story from your own life. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories that stir the heart and stay with you long after the screen fades to black. And remember to click the bell so you won't miss the next one. Your voice matters, your story matters, and we're honored to have you in this community. Until next time, take care and keep listening to the voices that matter most, starting with your own.